Today, I'd like to talk about what's happening with when one person is exposed to an inflammatory trigger and is maybe inflamed for maybe half an hour, versus another person who gets exposed to the same trigger and then they're in bed for days. Now, one of the things we have to understand is the inflammatory response is an interaction, and the interaction involves the inflammatory trigger and the pre-existing state of inflammation that exists beforehand. So we can always look at the response to some type of trigger as determined partially by their pre-existing or endogenous inflammatory response or inflammatory state. So if someone already has like chronic infections and barrier breakdowns and are severely vitamin D deficient and they have high amounts of free radicals and oxidative stress, and the other person doesn't, their response to the same exposure may be completely different. So the exposure may be an airborne allergen, it may be a dietary protein sensitivity, it may be muscle breakdown from a hard workout. It really doesn't matter. But when you see people that consistently have these exaggerated responses where if they get exposed to the wrong food, they're in bed for days. If they overtrain, they're in bed for days. They get exposed to something they're sensitive to, maybe being in a room with some mold in there, and they just take a little breath of that and it totally fall apart for days. You're really looking at someone who may have a high degree of endogenous state of inflammatory load. And that's where you may need to start with them. You really may want to really focus on how do you get their pre-existing underlying inflammatory responses under control instead of just focusing so much on the trigger itself. And there's a whole host of things that can impact endogenous inflammation. Person's muscle mass index, person's body fat index, whether they have leaky gut, leaky respiratory barriers, leaky lung barriers, whether they have any deficiencies and things like, especially like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K, their antioxidant status, their flavonoid status, their microbiome, specifically things like short chain fatty acids, um, any functions in the health of the regular T cells, their inflammatory resolution systems, their prostaglandin balances. There's a whole host of things that you need to, as a clinician, have as a checklist when you're seeing someone have a high degree of pre-existing inflammatory load. Then, as you do your medical history, you want to go through each one of those one by one, mark them off, and figure out what areas need to be addressed as a clinician.